This module will cover advanced analysis rules, loops, and conditionals. Analysis rules support many action types. We've already seen actions like fail test and declare execution issue, but other common actions include eval, exit procedure, repeat step, and call procedure. An eval action allows you to run arbitrary Python or Tcl code just like an eval step. Repeat step will repeat the step the analysis rule is attached to until a condition is met. Call procedure calls another procedure in the test case or from an external procedure library. Up to this point, we've only used the assert processor. Analysis rules can also be used to create charts, show messages, and store variables simply by changing the processor type. In our test case, we check the firmware version of our device under test. Now, if the firmware version is incorrect, there's no need to continue the test. We're probably going to be testing a certain version of code. So in the case that the firmware version is not the expected version, we might as well go ahead and just stop the execution of the test. So what I'm going to do is add a new analysis rule action under the when false section here. So I right click, insert rule action. If I click the drop down menu on the new action, I can see all the options we have. We can do a lot of different things here in this analysis rule. I'm going to scroll to the top and choose abort execution. I chose abort execution over abort test because abort execution will actually stop the execution, whereas abort test is more like this fail test action. It's just going to change the status of the test, but it won't actually stop the execution. So now that we're going to abort this test, let's tell the user why we are going to do that. So here in my execution issue for the failure case, I'm just going to add some text telling the user what is about to happen. Now, of course, if I run my test right now, it's still going to pass because we're still looking for this firmware version that's already present. But let's do a little negative testing. I'm just going to change this parameter slightly so that it's looking for a different version of firmware. And I'm going to save my test and run it. And we're going to see that the test does the firmware check step, notices that the firmware version is wrong, and then aborts immediately. So it doesn't do the interface check step. And looking at my execution message, I can see pretty clearly what the expected firmware was and what the actual firmware is. Next, we'll take a look at loops and conditionals. iTest supports loops and conditional steps in either Tcl or Python. Let's modify our test case a little bit. We're going to add a section that shuts down and re-enables the port based on a conditional and then repeats based on a loop. Let's add the steps needed to shut down and re-enable the interface. To do that, I'm going to capture those steps. I'm going to head to my topology file, right-click on my device, and start the session. I'm going to enter config mode for the interface that we want to shut down. Disable the interface, and then re-enable the interface. I can close my session, head back to my test case, and I'm just going to drag and drop the steps I need to my test case. So first, I'm going to click on the first command I need, and I can shift click to grab all three of these, and I'm just going to drag them right here onto step 4, which is going to place them after step 4. Go ahead and wrap these in a comment. Right click, click wrap in, and then comment. I'm going to call this shutdown and check interface. Now, none of these commands have responses that we need to read any data out of and therefore map, so we don't need to make a response map for these. We are going to need to check the interface after we disable it to make sure it's down, and then also after we re-enable it to make sure it's back up. So I can copy and paste my old show interfaces brief step. I'm going to paste it right here after set disable. And we are not looking for it to be up anymore, we're looking for it to be down. So all I need to do is change the expected value to down. And let's change the messaging here as well. So primary interface is up, that's not relevant to this anymore. Now we have some good execution messages to go with that analysis rule. And I'm going to paste the show interfaces brief step after I re-enable the interface as well. So in this case, we are still looking for it to be up, but we should still change our execution messages just to keep the user up to date on where they are in the test, make it as readable as possible. Let's go ahead and collapse these steps. And now we're ready to add a parameter. And what we're going to do is do this section based on the parameter being set or not. So I'm going to head to my parameters tab. I'm going to add another parameter and name it shutdown. Now I can change this type to Boolean, and that restricts me to the true or false values. So let's say if it's true, we're going to do that shutdown test. If it's false, we're not. I'm going to indicate that in my description field here. We'll head back to our steps page. And we're going to put all of these steps into an if statement based on our new parameter. So I'm going to shift click, select all the steps, right click, choose wrap in, and then if statement. And it's going to wrap all of those commands into an if statement. Now it gives us an example conditional statement here. We're going to replace that with a reference to our parameter. So I'm going to right click, choose insert, and then parameter. I'm going to choose the shutdown parameter that we just created. And because this is set as a Boolean type, it's going to do the true or false comparison right here. So we don't need to do an equals true or equals false. If the shutdown parameter is set to true, it'll execute these commands. If it's not, it won't. We can actually delete this else statement because we're not going to do anything in the case that the parameter is set to false. So now I can save and run my test. And we can see that we did shut down the interface and check it, and re-enable the interface and check it again. And if I look at my steps here, I can see that we did in fact go into the if statement and execute all the commands within the if. So next we're going to create a loop. We're going to execute this shutdown and re-enabling of the interface 3 times in a row. So I'll close my test report. We're going to go back to our parameters page, create a new parameter called iterations. We're going to make that an integer. We're going to set it to 3 for now and add a nice description of what this parameter is going to do. Back on my steps tab, I'm going to again shift click, select all my commands. I'm going to right click, choose wrap in and for loop. It gives you a nice sample for loop. If we left this alone, it would just execute it 10 times. What we're going to do is just replace this 10 with our parameter. So I just choose the iterations parameter, and that's going to be inserted right there into that loop. So let's save our test case and run it. And we should see 3 iterations of that shutdown and re-enable test. And it looks like we did. Let's take a look at the steps. We can see that we go inside our if statement. We can also go inside the for loop, and we can see all 3 iterations unrolled in our test report.